Hello, and welcome to Nostalgic Medicine, where we take a look at fascinating stories about the history of medicine and healthcare. Today's video will talk about how plants have been used to treat diseases, in particular, malaria. So, what do the common medications aspirin, morphine, and metformin, a common drug for diabetes, all have in common? The answer to this is that they are all chemicals which originate from plants and have actually been used for hundreds and sometimes even thousands of years to treat the same diseases that we use them to treat today. In fact, researchers estimate that an astonishing 25% of all medicines prescribed come from plant sources, and to add to this, you can probably get a higher number if you also counter drugs that come from fungi, such as penicillins, statins, and a few anti-cancer drugs. Now, we don't really know how exactly people in the past were able to figure out how random plants could cure illnesses, but let me just say that we've even observed that some animals are able to go and eat specific plants with medicinal properties when they're feeling unwell. Just search up the topic of zoo pharmacognosy to find out more about this. So I probably can make an entire video on how ancient herbal medicines have influenced modern medicine in general, but I want to focus today on probably the biggest success story ever involving a plant, and that's how an ancient Chinese herbal plant, which was used in China for thousands of years, actually ended up helping us find an effective treatment for malaria in the 20th century. So malaria is a disease that most people have heard about, and this is because it's one of the most common infectious diseases in the world, with an estimated 250 million cases and 600,000 deaths worldwide in 2020. In fact, malaria has always been among the leading killers worldwide, and some sources say that it's the single biggest killer of any disease ever in human history. And since malaria has been around for so long, then you shouldn't be surprised to hear that ancient medical doctors in places such as China and Greece over 2,000 years ago were very familiar with malaria and its symptoms, and they of course suggested a wide range of treatments for it. So one of the suggested treatments in ancient China was a herbal plant called Qinghao, which is also known as sweet wormwood in English, or by its scientific name Artemisia Annua. You can find a mention of this plant specifically in a medical textbook from 340 AD called Emergency Prescriptions Kept in One Sleeve. So this medical textbook recommends the Qinghao plant as a treatment for intermittent fever, which is basically a fever that comes and goes over the course of an illness, and this is a classical symptom of malaria. Now, this Artemisia plant appears in many other Chinese medicine textbooks as a treatment of the symptoms of malaria by multiple authors over the next 1,000 years. So these Chinese doctors surely must have been onto something, but it strangely was only ever mentioned in Chinese medicine literature, and this is despite China's extensive contact with places like India, the Islamic world, and Europe, which were also heavyweights of the ancient medical world. So it was actually a different plant which became popular as a treatment for malaria throughout the world, and this was the cinchona tree, specifically the bark of the tree. Now, the healing properties of the cinchona bark was actually discovered by native Peruvians in the 17th century, and this happened after Europeans introduced malaria into the New World, alongside many other deadly diseases like smallpox and yellow fever. Scientists would eventually figure out that the tree was effective at treating malaria because the cinchona bark contains a chemical called quinine, which kills the malaria parasite. And eventually in the 20th century, scientists would go on to create other compounds related to quinine, such as chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. And these drugs would end up being at the forefront of the global malaria eradication effort that was going on around the late 20th century. But as you might have guessed, since malaria is still a thing, this attempt was largely unsuccessful, which was mainly due to the emergence of quinine and chloroquine resistant parasites in regions of the world that were heavily inflicted with malaria, which included Southeast Asia. Now, this coincided with the Vietnam War in the 1960s, something that China was heavily involved in, meaning that they really needed to find an alternative treatment to chloroquine for their troops, because the Vietnamese jungles where most of the fighting took place was a breeding ground for malaria infection. So this led the Chinese government to set up a nationwide program called Project 523, and this project had the task of finding an alternative effective treatment for malaria to quinine. Now, this is where it gets interesting, as they mainly did this by investigating traditional Chinese herbs, because the chairman of China at the time, Mao Zedong, was a massive proponent of traditional Chinese medicine, saying that it was a quote, great treasure house. So now we get to the person who was primarily responsible for the success of Project 523. This was a chemist called Tu Youyou, and she was a specialist in traditional Chinese medicine and was the head of the Project 523 group at her local institute. So her group looked at over 2,000 traditional Chinese herbs and found about 640 different herbs in the traditional literature that was said to treat intermittent fever, which, like I said before, is a key symptom in malaria. The Artemisia, aka Qinghao tree that I mentioned before in particular, seemed to have been extremely effective at blocking the malaria parasite when they used animal models of malaria, but Yu's team found it hard to consistently replicate this, as you often need to do in scientific research, for people to take your results seriously. But then they had another look at the extraction process, which was suggested in the emergency prescriptions book, which I mentioned earlier, and they realized that the book advised you to soak the Artemisia plant in water, which implies that instead of using high boiling temperature to extract the chemicals from the plant, like is the standard process in extraction, you actually need to use low temperature to extract the chemicals. This was thankfully the magic formula that they needed, and Yu's team were able to isolate a chemical which proved safe and effective against malaria in humans, and they named this chemical Artemisinin after the plant. So these findings soon spread all over the world, and even Western scientists have found that artemisinin can be used for cases of quinine-resistant malaria, and even as a replacement for quinine-sensitive malaria, because there have been several clinical studies showing that artemisinin is even better at treating malaria than quinine or chloroquine. So now artemisinin and compounds related to it have surpassed quinine as the first line treatment for malaria all around the world, and to this day saves millions of lives every year. This treatment has now become so revolutionary that the World Health Organization has artemisinin on its list of essential medicines, and in 2015, Tu Youyou was awarded a Nobel Prize in Medicine for her discovery, which might surprise you to hear makes her the only Chinese person to ever win this award. So that's the story of how an ancient Chinese herb managed to revolutionize the treatment for one of the deadliest diseases of all time. I quite like this story as it serves as an example of how useful the plants we find in nature can be for curing diseases. Now I know many people will take this as a reason to say, why don't we just use the plant equivalents of medications to treat people, as they are 100% natural, but there's a reason that we doctors don't just prescribe plants. Some reasons include the fact that no two plants are the same, meaning that you'll get an inconsistent quantity of the substance you want. You also have to consider that plants contain several other substances which are either toxic or can interact with other medications that people take. So, my final word on herbal medicine is that even though many plants might contain several useful substances, we should leave the experimentation on medicinal plants to the chemist, who will then be able to make the safer and effective pill form of the plant substance.